In the ancient world, there was no nation more certain of its gods than Egypt. Along a thin green ribbon of life cut through a vast desert, an entire civilization had risen and flourished for more than 2,000 years, and the people who lived there did not believe their prosperity was an accident. They believed it was the gift of the gods, and at the center of those gods stood the river. The Nile was not merely water to the Egyptians, it was Hapi, the spirit of the inundation, the bringer of the black silt that made the fields fertile. It was bound up with Osiris, the lord of the dead and the renewal of life, whose very lifeblood the river was said to be. It was guarded by Khnum, the ram-headed god who was thought to control its flow at the cataracts. To stand on the bank of the Nile in Egypt was, in the mind of an Egyptian, to stand in the presence of the divine. And it was precisely here, at the water's edge, that the god of an enslaved and forgotten people chose to begin a confrontation that would shake the most powerful kingdom on earth to its foundations. The book of Exodus tells us exactly what was at stake, and it does not leave it to be guessed. In Exodus 12, verse 12, the Lord declares, "On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord." That single sentence is the key that unlocks everything that follows. The 10 plagues were never simply a contest of stubbornness between a prophet and a king. They were a deliberate, systematic dismantling of the entire Egyptian pantheon, one god at a time, until the question of who truly ruled the heavens and the earth had only one possible answer. To understand why this confrontation happened at all, we have to go back to how Israel came to be in Egypt in the first place. Generations earlier, in the days of Joseph, a famine had driven the family of Jacob down into Egypt, where Joseph had risen to become second only to Pharaoh. They had been welcomed, given the fertile land of Goshen in the eastern Nile Delta, and there they had grown. But time erodes gratitude. Exodus 1 verse 8 marks the turn with chilling brevity. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. This new dynasty looked at the Israelites and saw not guests but a threat. They had multiplied until they filled the land, and a fearful throne does ruthless things. The Egyptians put slave masters over them, worked them mercilessly in brick and mortar and in every kind of field labor. And when even that did not break their numbers, Pharaoh gave the unthinkable command that every Hebrew boy born should be thrown into the Nile. The very river the Egyptians worshipped as the source of life had been turned, by royal decree, into an instrument of death for the children of Israel. That detail is not incidental. The river would have a reckoning of its own. It was into this world of forced labor and infant drowning that Moses was born, hidden 3 months by his mother, set adrift in a basket on that same Nile, and drawn from the water by Pharaoh's own daughter to be raised in the palace of the very king who wanted him dead. As a grown man, he fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew, and for 40 years he became a shepherd in the wilderness of Midian, a fugitive with a price on his head and a people on his conscience. And then, at a burning bush that flamed without being consumed, the God of his fathers spoke to him. The Lord told Moses he had seen the misery of his people and heard their cry, and that he was sending Moses back to Egypt to bring them out. Moses, who knew exactly how impossible that was, raised objection after objection. But God gave him a name and a promise. In Exodus 3 verse 19, the Lord told him plainly what to expect. "But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him." The resistance was foreseen. The hardness of Pharaoh's heart was not a surprise that derailed the plan. It was the stage on which the plan would be displayed. Moses returned to Egypt with his brother Aaron as his spokesman, and together they stood before Pharaoh with a demand that must have sounded like madness in the throne room of a god-king. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, 'Let my people go.'" Pharaoh's reply, in Exodus 5 verse 2, frames the entire war of the plagues in a single defiant question. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." There it is, the heart of the matter. Pharaoh did not deny the existence of gods. He was surrounded by them, served by them, and considered himself one of them. What he denied was that this particular God, the God of slaves, had any claim on him at all. The plagues would be the answer to his question. By the end, he would know the name of the Lord, whether he wanted to or not. The first encounter was a kind of overture, a warning shot before the true assault began. Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh, and it became a serpent. It was a sign loaded with meaning, because the cobra, the uraeus, was the emblem of royal and divine power in Egypt, coiled on the very crown of Pharaoh as a symbol of protection. Pharaoh summoned his magicians, and by their secret arts they did the same. Their staffs became serpents too. But then Exodus 7 verse 12 tells us, Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. The symbol of Egypt's divine sovereignty was devoured before the king's eyes, and still his heart was hard. The contest was set. The magicians could imitate, but they could not undo. From here on, the gap between imitation and authority would widen with every blow. Then came the first true plague, and it struck the river. God sent Moses to meet Pharaoh in the morning at the bank of the Nile, at the water's edge, and the command was specific and devastating. In Exodus 7 verse 17, the Lord says, "By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood." This was no random calamity. It was aimed with precision at the beating heart of Egyptian religion and Egyptian survival. Aaron raised the staff and struck the water. And what follows in Exodus 7 verses 20 and 21 is the collapse of a god in real time. All the water was changed into blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. Hapi, the spirit of the inundation, who was praised in Egyptian hymns as the one who floods the fields that Ra has made, who fills the storehouses and makes the granaries wide, now ran red and putrid. Osiris, whose lifeblood the Nile was said to be, was profaned. Khnum, the guardian of the river's source, could not guard it. The fish that the Egyptians ate and even venerated floated dead on the surface, and the stench of decay rose over the land of the gods. There is an unmistakable justice in where the judgment fell. The Egyptians had thrown Hebrew infants into this river to drown. Now the river itself was turned to blood, and the people who had defiled it with innocent death were left digging desperately along the banks for water they could drink. The very source of Egypt's pride had become the first witness against it. And yet the heart of Pharaoh would not bend. His magicians, by their arts, managed to produce a small imitation of the sign, and that was apparently enough for the king to wave the whole thing away. Exodus 7 verse 23 records the willful blindness with quiet weight. Instead, he turned and went into his palace, and did not take even this to heart. 7 days passed while all of Egypt dug along the Nile for water. The first pillar of the pantheon had fallen. The river god lay exposed and powerless, and the man who called himself the son of the gods retreated behind palace walls and pretended he had seen nothing. He had asked who the Lord was. The answer had only begun. 7 days after the Nile ran red, the water cleared, the stench faded, and Pharaoh no doubt told himself the worst was behind him. He had survived the first blow by refusing to look at it. But the God who had struck the river was not finished with Egypt, and the second plague would rise out of that same water in a form the Egyptians themselves had taught their children to cherish. Moses came again before Pharaoh with the unchanging demand, and this time the warning carried a strange creature in it. In Exodus 8 verse 2, the Lord declares through Moses, "If you refuse to let them go, I will plague your whole country with frogs." To a modern ear that sounds almost comic, a kingdom brought low by frogs. But to an Egyptian it would have landed very differently, because the frog was sacred, and the goddess it represented sat close to the mystery of life itself. Her name was Heket, and she was depicted as a woman with the head of a frog, or simply as a frog. The Egyptians had watched for centuries as the Nile receded after its annual flood, and left the marshy ground teeming with frogs, thousands of them appearing as if conjured out of the mud, and they had read in that explosion of life a sign of fertility and new birth. Heket became the goddess of childbirth, the divine midwife who breathed life into the bodies formed on the potter's wheel and who was invoked by women in the dangerous hours of labor. Amulets shaped like frogs were worn for protection in pregnancy. To kill a frog deliberately was, in some periods, a serious offense, because the creature belonged to the goddess. The frog was a symbol of life multiplying, of safe delivery, of the goddess's blessing on the womb. And it was this very symbol that God would now turn into a torment so total that the Egyptians would be sick of life itself. When Pharaoh again refused, Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff over the streams and canals, and ponds of Egypt and the land answered. Exodus 8 verse 6 records it with stark simplicity. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. What had been a trickle of blessing each year became a flood of horror. The frogs did not stay in the marshes where they belonged. They came up into the houses, into the bedrooms, onto the beds, into the ovens and the kneading troughs where bread was made. There was no room in Egypt free of them, no clean surface, no quiet corner, no place to set down food or to lie down to sleep. The goddess of fertility had, in the eyes of her own worshippers, overflowed her banks. The blessing had become a curse precisely by becoming excessive. Life multiplying without limit is not a gift. It is a plague, and the Egyptians, who had honored Heket as the giver of life, now could not take a step without crushing her sacred creatures underfoot. Once more, Pharaoh's magicians rose to the challenge, and once more they managed an imitation. By their secret arts, they too brought frogs up upon the land. But here the futility of their craft becomes almost absurd, because the problem was not a shortage of frogs. Egypt was already drowning in them. The magicians could add to the plague, but they had no power whatsoever to remove it. Their gods could pile horror upon horror. They could not lift a single frog from a single bed. And in that helplessness the king finally cracked, at least for a moment. For the first time, Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron and asked for something he had never asked before. In Exodus 8 verse 8, the proud king who had said, "Who is the Lord?" now pleads, "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." It was the first confession wrung out of him, the first admission that the magicians of Egypt were of no use, and that only the God of the Hebrews could end what the God of the Hebrews had begun. What happens next is one of the most revealing exchanges in the whole account, because Moses does something that exposes the absolute control God held over this judgment. he turns to Pharaoh and offers him the honor of setting the time. In Exodus 8, verse 9, Moses says, "I leave to you the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs." And Pharaoh's answer is the detail that has puzzled and humbled readers for thousands of years. He says in verse 10, a single word that reveals how deeply a hard heart will cling to even one more night of its own way. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. Not now. Not this hour. Not this very minute when he is surrounded by the filth of 1,000,000 frogs. He chooses to spend one more night in the torment rather than yield a moment sooner than he must. It is a window into the strange logic of pride, which would rather suffer on its own terms than be relieved on someone else's. Moses simply answers, "It will be as you say, so that you may know there is no one like the Lord our God." The point of the entire contest is pressed home again. This was never about frogs. It was about knowing who the Lord is, and the Lord answered exactly on schedule. The next day Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs, and Exodus 8, verse 13, records the precision of the deliverance, and the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, and in the fields. Every frog that had imitated life now lay dead. The Egyptians gathered them into heaps, pile upon reeking pile, until the land that had stunk of blood now stunk of decay a second time. There is a quiet theological argument buried in that detail. Heket was the goddess who gave life and presided over birth, and here her sacred creatures lay rotting in mounds across the whole country, gathered like refuse, while the people gagged on the smell. The goddess of fertility had been answered by the God of Israel with death heaped in the streets, and she had been powerless to save even the frogs that bore her image. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen, just as the Lord had said. Relief was his undoing. As long as the frogs covered his bed, he was willing to promise anything. The instant his bed was clean again, the promise meant nothing. The third plague came without warning. There was no morning audience at the riverbank, no formal demand laid before the throne, no chance for Pharaoh to weigh his answer and choose his moment. After the frogs there had been negotiation. After this there would be none. God simply told Moses to have Aaron stretch out his staff and strike the dust of the ground, and from that dust would come the next judgment. The shift in method is itself a message. The warnings were not infinite. A king who treats every reprieve as permission to harden will eventually find that the warnings stop and the blows simply fall. And this blow struck at the ground itself, at the very soil of Egypt, which the Egyptians also clothed in the person of a god. His name was Geb, the god of the earth. In Egyptian cosmology, Geb was the physical land laid out beneath the sky, the husband of the sky goddess and the father of Osiris. He was the ground that received the seed and gave the harvest, the firm foundation on which the whole green life of the Nile Valley rested. The Egyptians pictured him reclining beneath the arch of the heavens, and from his body, they believed, came the vegetation and the abundance of the soil. To strike the dust of Egypt was, in symbolic terms, to strike the body of Geb himself, and from the god of the earth would come not blessing, but a swarming, biting torment. Aaron stretched out his hand and struck the dust, and Exodus 8, verse 17, records the immediacy and the scale of what followed. When Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust of the ground, gnats came on people and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. The Hebrew word here describes tiny stinging insects, gnats or lice, the kind that come up in clouds and settle on every exposed surface of skin, that crawl into the eyes and the nostrils and the hair, that bite without ceasing and cannot be brushed away, because there are simply too many. There is no negotiation possible with such a thing, no bargain to strike, no promise to extract, because the torment is not in the bedroom or the oven where it might be cleaned out. It is in the air, on the body, in every breath, the dust of the ground, the substance the Egyptians walked on and farmed and built with, had become a living affliction. Geb's body had turned against the people who honored him. But the most important thing about this third plague is not the insects. It is what happened when the magicians of Egypt tried, for the third time, to match the sign. They had imitated the blood. They had imitated the frogs. Now they gathered their secret arts and reached out to produce gnats from the dust, as Aaron had done, and for the first time they failed. Exodus 8 verse 18 states it plainly and without drama. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not. Since the gnats were on people and animals everywhere, they too were covered. Picture the scene. The wise men of Egypt, the keepers of its sacred knowledge, the men who served Pharaoh as the visible proof that Egypt's gods could answer the God of the Hebrews blow for blow, stand there working their arts and producing nothing, while the very gnats they are failing to conjure crawl over their own arms and faces and bite them like everyone else. The defenders of the pantheon could not even protect themselves. And it was the magicians themselves who said so. These were not Hebrews, not believers, not allies of Moses. They were the religious establishment of Egypt, men whose entire authority depended on the power of their gods, and they were the first inside Egypt to name what was happening. In Exodus 8 verse 19, they go to Pharaoh and confess, "This is the finger of God." It is a remarkable admission, and the phrase is precise. They do not say it is the trick of a clever sorcerer or the work of a rival magician. They say it is the finger of God, the direct touch of a divine power that their own arts cannot reproduce or resist. They had reached the limit of everything they knew, and beyond that limit they recognized something they could only call by one name. The men whose job was to defend Egypt's gods became witnesses against them. There is a deliberate restraint in their words that makes them even more telling. They call it the finger of God, not the fist, not the hand, not the full weight of his arm, only the finger. And already the finger alone had outmatched everything Egypt could muster. If the mere finger of this god could fill the land with gnats that the wisest men in Egypt could not counter, what would happen when the hand came down in full? But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord had said. With the fourth plague, the rhythm of the confrontation returns to its formal pattern. But a new and decisive element enters the story. Once again, God sends Moses to confront Pharaoh in the early morning, as the king goes down to the water, and once again the demand is the unchanging one. "Let my people go, that they may worship me." But this time the threat carries within it a distinction that had only been implied before, and is now made explicit and unmistakable. God was no longer simply striking Egypt. He was about to draw a line through the land and put his own people visibly, deliberately, on the safe side of it. The plague itself was a swarm. The text speaks of dense swarms of flies that would fill the houses of the Egyptians and even cover the ground they stood on. To grasp the religious sting of this, we have to understand how the Egyptians regarded the insects that buzzed and crawled through their world. The scarab beetle, the dung beetle that rolled its ball across the sand, was one of the most sacred creatures in all of Egypt, identified with the god Khepri, who was pictured as a beetle or as a man with a beetle for a head. The Egyptians had watched the scarab push its ball of dung and seen in it an image of the sun being rolled across the sky, and from the beetle that seemed to emerge spontaneously from the earth, they had drawn their whole hope of self-creation and rebirth. Khepri was the rising sun, the god of coming into being, the symbol of life renewing itself each morning. Scarab amulets were among the most common sacred objects in Egypt, placed on the living for protection and on the dead for resurrection. And it was this whole sphere, the insect dressed as a god, and the god expected to control the insects, that the fourth plague invaded. The creatures the Egyptians had made into emblems of the sun and of rebirth now poured over the land as filth and corruption, and the gods who were supposed to command them could not turn back a single fly. But the heart of this plague is the line that God drew, and he announced it before he sent it. In Exodus 8 verse 22, the Lord says, "But on that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land." This is the first time the account stops to make the separation explicit, and the reason given is everything. So that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. The point was not merely to punish Egypt. The point was to demonstrate with a precision that no one could explain away, that the God of Israel was sovereign over the geography of Egypt itself, able to send a plague up to an invisible boundary and stop it dead. The swarms would blanket the homes of the Egyptians and not touch the homes of the Hebrews a short distance away. No natural calamity behaves like that. Flies do not respect property lines or ethnic borders. Only a directing hand could draw such a distinction. And that was exactly the proof God intended. And it came to pass exactly as he said. Exodus 8 verse 24 records the devastation and the boundary in one breath. And the Lord did this. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace and into the houses of his officials. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined by the flies. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined, and yet in Goshen the air was clear. The contrast was the whole argument. Every Egyptian swatting helplessly at the swarms in his ruined house, every official in a palace overrun, could have ridden a short way east and found the land of the slaves untouched, the Hebrews going about their work in peace under a clean sky. The God who had turned Egypt's river and Egypt's dust and Egypt's sacred frogs against it was now showing that he could shelter whom he pleased even in the middle of the judgment. He was not a local god bound to a territory. He was the one who decided, house by house, where the plague would fall. This time the pressure produced something new from Pharaoh. Not surrender, but compromise. He summoned Moses and Aaron and made the first of several attempts to grant the demand while emptying it of meaning. In Exodus 8 verse 25 he says, "Go, sacrifice to your God here in the land. Worship your God if you must, but do it inside Egypt under my eye, on my terms, without leaving." It was a politician's offer, a concession designed to look generous while conceding nothing essential. Moses refused it, and his reasoning is worth hearing, because it shows he understood Egyptian religion better than to be trapped by it. He answered that the sacrifices the Hebrews would offer were detestable to the Egyptians, and that if they sacrificed such things in plain sight of the Egyptians, the people would stone them. The animals Israel would offer to the Lord were animals the Egyptians held sacred. To worship the God of Israel in the middle of Egypt was impossible, precisely because Egypt's gods were everywhere, and the very act of sacrifice would be read as blasphemy against them. Moses insisted on the original terms, a 3-day journey into the wilderness to worship as God had commanded. Cornered, Pharaoh gave ground again, and his second offer reveals how a hard heart bargains. In Exodus 8, verse 28, he says, "I will let you go to offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the wilderness, but you must not go very far. Now pray for me. You may go, but not far." Always the qualification, always the leash. Moses agreed to pray, and the Lord did what Moses asked. Not a single fly remained in all of Egypt. But this time also Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. With the fifth plague, the judgments of God crossed a threshold they had not crossed before. The first four had been afflictions of misery and humiliation. The river had been undrinkable, the frogs revolting, the gnats maddening, the flies ruinous. But through all of it, the people of Egypt and their animals had survived. Now, for the first time, the plague would kill, and it would kill in the place where Egypt kept both its wealth and some of its most sacred gods, among the cattle of the field. Moses came once more before Pharaoh with the familiar demand, but the warning attached to it now carried death in it. If Pharaoh still refused to let the people go, the hand of the Lord would fall upon the livestock of Egypt with a deadly plague. To understand the weight of this blow, we have to see how much of Egypt's life, both economic and religious, was bound up in its cattle. The herds were the engine of the whole agricultural system. The oxen that pulled the plows and threshed the grain, the cows that gave milk, the animals that represented a family's stored wealth and a nation's strength. To strike the livestock was to strike Egypt's treasury and its food supply at once. But it was far more than an economic blow, because the bull and the cow stood among the most exalted figures in the Egyptian pantheon. In the great city of Memphis, the Egyptians worshipped the Apis bull, a living animal chosen for its sacred markings and kept in luxury as the incarnation of the god, associated with Ptah the creator and with strength and fertility. When an Apis bull died, it was mummified and entombed with the honors of royalty in vast underground galleries, and a new one was sought to take its place. At Heliopolis, there was the Mnevis bull, another sacred living god, and above them stood Hathor, one of the greatest goddesses of Egypt, depicted as a cow or as a woman crowned with cow's horns and the sun disk, the goddess of love, of motherhood, of joy and nourishment, the divine cow whose milk was said to sustain the pharaohs themselves. The cattle of Egypt were not merely animals. Some of them were gods, and the gods were imagined in their form. And it was this whole sacred herd that the plague now invaded. God did not strike quietly or by ambush. He announced it in advance with a fixed time, so that no one could mistake it for chance. In Exodus 9 verse 3 the Lord warns, "The hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys and camels, and on your cattle, sheep and goats." Every category of domestic animal is named, the whole living wealth of the nation marked for death. But once again, woven into the very announcement of the judgment, came the line of separation that had become the signature of these plagues. In Exodus 9 verse 4, the Lord continues, "But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die." The distinction was no longer a surprise to be revealed. It was now a declared policy of the God who was dismantling Egypt. Egyptian cattle would die, Israelite cattle would live, and the boundary between them would hold without a single exception. Then God fixed the hour. He said the Lord would do this the next day in the land, and it came. Exodus 9 verse 6 records the fulfillment with the same merciless precision as the warning, and the next day the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. The herds of Egypt lay dead in the fields, the sacred and the common alike. The animals that embodied Hathor lay still. The bulls that were honored as the living forms of the gods were carrion. And in Goshen, not one Hebrew animal so much as stumbled. The contrast was again the whole sermon. Egypt's gods were dying in the dust of Egypt's own fields, while the cattle of the slaves grazed untouched. The goddess of nourishment could not nourish. The bull gods of strength had no strength to save even themselves. There is a deep irony in the fact that the Egyptians worshipped the very creatures that were now dying by the thousand. Every dead bull in an Egyptian field was a silent argument. If the Apis bull was a god, why did the cattle of Egypt die? If Hathor sustained life with her milk, why were her own cattle struck down? And here, the account gives us a glimpse into Pharaoh's mind that is almost more revealing than his words. After the plague struck, Pharaoh did something significant. He sent men to investigate. Exodus 9 verse 7 tells us, Pharaoh investigated and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. He checked. He sent to Goshen to see whether the distinction Moses had announced was real, and he found that it was. Not even one. The king now had hard, verified evidence in his own hands, gathered by his own investigators, that the God of Israel had done exactly what he said and had drawn the exact line he promised. And what did he do with the proof he had gone out of his way to obtain? The same verse finishes the thought. Yet his heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go. After the investigation, after the confirmation, after holding in his hand the verified evidence of a power that killed Egypt's cattle and spared Israel's, down to the last animal, his heart was unyielding. The sixth plague began with an image so strange and so deliberate that it must have been meant as a sign in itself. God told Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of soot from a furnace, and then, standing before Pharaoh, to toss it into the air so that it would drift out over the whole land of Egypt. There was no warning this time, no morning meeting at the river, no demand laid before the throne for Pharaoh to refuse. Like the plague of gnats, this one fell without negotiation. But the gesture that launched it carried a meaning that an Egyptian would have felt in his bones. Soot from a furnace, ash thrown toward heaven, was an inversion of Egyptian ritual. The Egyptians had ceremonies in which the ashes of sacrifices were scattered as a blessing meant to ward off evil and spread well-being across the land. Now Moses took the ash of the furnace, the residue perhaps of the very kilns where Hebrew slaves had baked the bricks of Egypt's glory, and flung it into the sky, and instead of blessing it, carried disease to every living body it touched. The plague it became was boils, festering sores that broke out on people and on the animals that had survived, painful eruptions of the skin that left the body raw and suffering. And with this, the judgments of God arrived at last upon the bodies of the Egyptians themselves. The water, the dust, the air, the herds had all been struck, but the people had walked through it in their own flesh unharmed. Now the affliction was on their skin, on their faces and their hands, inescapable because a man cannot step outside his own body. To strike the body with disease was to challenge yet another whole division of the Egyptian pantheon, the gods of healing and of medicine, who were many and powerful. There was Sekhmet, the fierce lioness goddess, who was believed both to send plague and pestilence, and to hold the power to heal it, the goddess to whom the Egyptians prayed for protection from exactly this kind of bodily affliction. There was Imhotep, the brilliant architect and physician of ancient Egypt, who had been deified after his death and worshipped as a god of medicine, to whom the sick came seeking cures. There was Isis, the great goddess of magic and healing, whose name was invoked in countless spells over the bodies of the suffering. Egypt was famous in the ancient world for its physicians and its medical knowledge, and behind that knowledge stood a whole company of gods believed to guard the body against sickness. The sixth plague threw all of that into the open and found it empty, and the account drives the point home in the most pointed way imaginable, by showing us what became of the magicians, the very men who embodied Egypt's claim to sacred and protective power. Exodus 9 verse 11 records their final humiliation. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them and on all the Egyptians. This is the last we see of the magicians in the whole story, and it is a devastating exit. These were the men who at the beginning had matched Aaron sign for sign, who had turned their staffs to serpents and conjured blood and frogs. Now they cannot even stand. They are not merely defeated in a contest of power. They are physically broken, unable to hold themselves upright in Moses' presence, their own bodies erupting with the very disease their gods of healing were supposed to prevent. The defenders of the pantheon could not protect a single inch of their own skin. But the sixth plague carries something else, a shift in the language of the story that readers have wrestled with for thousands of years. Through the first 5 plagues, the account told us again and again that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. The hardening was his own act, his own repeated choice, made again and again in the face of mounting evidence. But now, at the 6th plague, the language changes. Exodus 9 verse 12 tells us, "But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses." For the first time, the text says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. This is one of the most profound moments in the entire narrative. For 5 plagues, Pharaoh had hardened himself, choosing his pride over the truth time after time. There comes a point in that long refusal where a man's choices become his character, where the hardening he has practiced so many times becomes the hardening he can no longer escape. When the text finally says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, it is not introducing a new injustice. It is confirming a settled state. The man who insisted on his own way received his own way, hardened into permanence. The 7th plague opens differently from all that came before it, because before God sent it, he stopped to explain why he had not already destroyed Egypt entirely. Moses was sent to confront Pharaoh once more at the river in the early morning, but the message he carried this time was longer and weightier than any yet, and it pulled back the curtain on the whole purpose of the plagues. Through Moses, God told Pharaoh that by now he could have stretched out his hand and struck him and his people with a plague that would have wiped them from the earth. But he had not. And in Exodus 9 verse 16, the Lord gives the reason. "But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." There it was, stated plainly. The point of this long and escalating contest was never merely to free Israel by the shortest path. It was to display before Egypt and before the whole world who the Lord truly was, so that his name would be spoken in every land. Then God announced the plague, and for the first time he did something merciful in the very midst of the threat. He warned the Egyptians to take shelter. In Exodus 9 verse 18, the Lord declares, "Therefore, at this time tomorrow, I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt, from the day it was founded till now. The worst storm in the history of the nation, fixed for the same hour the next day. But then God did something he had not done with any earlier plague. He told the Egyptians how to escape it. He warned them to bring their servants and their animals in from the fields, because every person and every animal still outside when the hail fell would die. For the first time, the judgment came with an open door of mercy. And here the account records something remarkable: a crack of light in the darkness of Egypt's stubbornness. Some of the Egyptians listened. Exodus 9 verses 20 and 21 makes a distinction not between Israel and Egypt, but within Egypt itself. Those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside, but those who ignored the word of the Lord left their slaves and livestock in the field. After 6 plagues, the word of the Lord had begun to do its work even in the hearts of Egyptians. To strike from the sky was to invade the domain of yet another tier of Egyptian gods, the deities of the heavens and the weather. Nut was the great goddess of the sky, depicted as a woman arched over the whole earth, her body the vault of the heavens from which no harm was supposed to come, without the will of the gods. Shu was the god of the air and the atmosphere who held the sky aloft. And there was Seth, the turbulent god of storms and chaos and of the desert's violence, the one the Egyptians both feared and tried to appease as the master of destructive weather. The sky over Egypt was a roof of gods, and from that roof the rain and the wind were thought to come at divine command. Now the God of Israel would turn that roof into a weapon. When the hour came, Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, and the heavens broke open. Exodus 9 verses 23 and 24 describes a thing Egypt had never seen. The Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Thunder rolled across a land that rarely heard it. Lightning struck the ground, and hail hammered down, mingled with fire that ran along the earth. The storm beat down everything left in the open, and it stripped the fields, shattering the trees and flattening the crops. And in the middle of it, as always, the boundary held. Exodus 9 verse 26 makes the separation explicit one more time. The only place it did not hail was the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. Fire fell from heaven across Egypt, and over Goshen the sky was quiet. This time the violence of the storm broke something loose in Pharaoh that no earlier plague had reached. He sent for Moses and Aaron, and for the first time in the entire contest, he made a confession that sounded like genuine repentance. In Exodus 9 verse 27, the proud king says words no one had heard from him before. "This time I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong." It is a stunning admission from the man who had begun by sneering, "Who is the Lord?" He goes further, begging Moses to pray that the thunder and hail might stop. But Moses was not deceived. He agreed to spread out his hands to the Lord so the thunder would stop. But then he added in Exodus 9, verse 30, a sentence that strips the confession bare. "But I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord God." Moses went out, spread his hands, and the thunder and hail stopped. And the moment it did, Pharaoh proved Moses right. Exodus 9 verses 34 and 35 close the account with grim familiarity. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go. The confession evaporated with the clouds. By the time the 8th plague approached, something had changed in Pharaoh's own house. The relentless pressure of the judgments had not yet broken the king, but it had broken the will of the men around him. When Moses and Aaron came before Pharaoh this time and warned that locusts would cover the face of the land and devour everything the hail had spared, they delivered their message and turned and left. And what happened after they walked out is one of the most telling scenes in the whole account. Pharaoh's own officials came to him and pleaded with him to give in. In Exodus 10 verse 7, the men who serve the throne say to their king, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go, so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined? Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" The court itself could see what the king refused to see. The advisers who had once stood behind Pharaoh's defiance now begged him to end it. The pressure from his own officials forced Pharaoh into another round of bargaining. He called Moses and Aaron back and seemed ready to relent, asking who exactly would be going to worship. When Moses answered that they would all go, young and old, sons and daughters, flocks and herds, Pharaoh's true intentions surfaced. In Exodus 10 verse 11, he refuses with a sneer, "No, have only the men go and worship the Lord, since that's what you have been asking for. Let the men go, but keep the women and children and the livestock as hostages in Egypt, so that the men would be bound to return." And with that, Moses and Aaron were driven out of Pharaoh's presence, and the plague was loosed. To send locusts against Egypt was to attack the gods responsible for the harvest. The Egyptians honored deities tied to the grain and the fertility of the fields, among them Osiris, who was bound up not only with the Nile and the dead, but with the green grain that rose from the earth and was the very image of his death and resurrection. There was Nepri, a god of grain, and Renenutet, the cobra goddess of the harvest and of nourishment, who was invoked to guard the crops and grant a full storehouse. The locust was the ancient world's most dreaded agricultural catastrophe, a living cloud that could strip a country bare in hours, and the Egyptians had gods precisely to stand between them and that ruin. God brought it on a wind. Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt, and the Lord sent an east wind that blew across the land all that day and all that night, and by morning the wind had carried in the locusts. Exodus 10 verses 14 and 15 describes a devastation total and final. They invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. They covered all the ground until it was black. They devoured all that was left after the hail, everything growing in the fields and the fruit on the trees. Nothing green remained on tree or plant in all the land of Egypt. Nothing green remained. Whatever the hail had beaten down, the locusts now consumed to the root and the bark, until the entire country was stripped to a barren brown waste. The gods of the grain could not save a single stalk. Osiris, the god of the green and growing thing, watched the green devoured to nothing. Renenutet, the guardian of the harvest, guarded an empty field. The completeness of the ruin broke Pharaoh again, and again his repentance came faster and sounded more desperate than before. He hurriedly summoned Moses and Aaron, and in Exodus 10 verse 16, he confesses with an urgency that outstrips even his words during the hail. "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you." He begs forgiveness just this once more, and pleads that this deadly plague be taken away. It is the language of a man at the end of his resources, and for the second time, the proud king of Egypt stands before two Hebrew shepherds and admits that he has sinned. Moses went out and prayed, and the Lord answered by changing the wind. A powerful west wind caught up the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea until not a single locust was left anywhere in Egypt. And once more the relief undid the repentance. Exodus 10 verse 20 records the now familiar collapse, but with the weight of the divine hand pressed firmly upon it. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. Twice now Pharaoh had said the words, "I have sinned," and twice the words had proven hollow, spoken under the lash and abandoned the instant the lash was lifted. A confession that lasts only as long as the consequence is no confession at all. The 9th plague came, like the 3rd and the 6th before it, without warning. There was no morning confrontation at the river, no demand spoken before the throne, no chance for Pharaoh to bargain or refuse. God simply told Moses to stretch out his hand toward the sky, and what happened next struck at the very summit of the Egyptian pantheon, at the God above all gods, the one the Egyptians believed could never be defeated, never be hidden, never be put out. For of all the deities of Egypt, none stood higher than the sun. The sun was the supreme power in Egyptian religion, worshipped under many names across the long centuries of the civilization. He was Ra, the great creator who sailed his solar bark across the heavens each day and through the underworld each night, the source of all life and warmth and order. The god from whom the pharaohs themselves claimed descent. He was Amun-Ra in the heyday of Thebes, the king of the gods, hidden and supreme. In one extraordinary period, he had been worshipped as the Aten, the visible disk of the sun. The rising of the sun each dawn was the daily proof of Ra's victory over the forces of darkness and chaos, the renewal of creation itself. To an Egyptian, the one absolutely certain thing in all the world was that the sun would rise. Ra was eternal and unconquerable, and now the god of a nation of slaves would reach up and turn off the sun. Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and darkness fell over Egypt, but it was no ordinary darkness. Exodus 10 verses 22 and 23 describes a thing that should have been impossible. So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. The text says the darkness could be felt, a thick, smothering, palpable blackness that pressed in on the people and held them frozen in place. For 3 days no Egyptian could see his own hand, could not see his neighbor, could not rise from where he sat. The whole life of the nation simply stopped, and Ra did not rise. For 3 days the supreme god of Egypt, the unconquerable sun, was simply gone, blotted out, powerless. While his people sat paralyzed in a darkness their greatest deity could not pierce. Every other plague had attacked something the gods governed. This plague erased the chief god himself, and as always, the boundary held. And here the contrast was at its most absolute, because it was a contrast of light against dark. The same verse finishes, "Yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived, while Egypt sat smothered in a darkness that could be felt. In Goshen the lamps burned, and the sun shone, and the Hebrews went about their lives in the light." When the 3 days had passed, Pharaoh made his final attempt to bargain, and it was the closest he ever came to surrender without actually reaching it. He summoned Moses and offered nearly everything. The people could go, the men and the women and the children all together. Only one condition remained. In Exodus 10 verse 24 he says, "Go worship the Lord. Even your women and children may go with you. Only leave your flocks and herds behind. Leave the animals. Keep back the flocks and herds as the last hostage, the final string by which he might still pull Israel back to Egypt." And Moses refused it as completely as he had refused the first. His answer in Exodus 10 verse 26 gives no ground at all. Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind. We have to use some of them in worshipping the Lord our God, and until we get there, we will not know what we are to use to worship the Lord. Not a hoof. This final refusal broke whatever restraint remained in the king, and his hardened heart turned at last to open threat. In Exodus 10 verse 28, he drives Moses from his presence with words full of menace. "Get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die." And Moses answered him with a calm that must have chilled the throne room. In Exodus 10 verse 29, he replies simply, "Just as you say, I will never appear before you again." Moses would not need to. The next time the two of them would have dealings, it would be in the dead of night, over the body of Pharaoh's own son. The 10th plague was different from everything that came before it, and Egypt knew it was coming, because Moses had announced it before he was driven from the throne room for the last time. There would be no slow escalation this time, no bargaining, no relief that could be undone. This blow would fall once in the dark, and it would fall on the one God the previous 9 plagues had left untouched, the God who sat on the throne of Egypt. For the Egyptians believed that Pharaoh was no mere man. He was the living Horus, the son of Ra, divinity in human form, the point where the world of the gods met the world of men. His authority was not political, but cosmic. He was the guarantor of order, the bridge between heaven and earth, a god who ruled gods. Every plague so far had answered a deity in the river, or the field, or the sky. The last plague would answer the deity on the throne, and it would do so by reaching into his own house and taking the son who was meant to be the next god-king of Egypt. Before he was banished, Moses had delivered the final warning, and it named the scope of the coming judgment with terrible clarity. In Exodus 11 verses 4 and 5, the Lord declares through him, "About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave, who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well, from the palace to the mill, from the heir of the god-king to the child of the lowest slave, no Egyptian house would be spared." And at the very top of that list stood the firstborn of Pharaoh himself, the prince who carried the divine line, the boy in whom the godhood of Egypt's monarchy was meant to continue. But the 10th plague is not remembered chiefly for the death it brought to Egypt. It is remembered for the deliverance it brought to Israel, and for the strange and solemn provision by which the angel of death would pass over the houses of the Hebrews. For this was the night God instituted the Passover, and the instructions he gave were exact and heavy with meaning. Each household was to take a lamb without defect, a year-old male, and keep it until the appointed evening, and then the whole assembly of Israel was to slaughter it at twilight. The blood was not to be wasted. In Exodus 12 verse 7, the command is given, "Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs." They were to roast the lamb and eat it that night, with bread made without yeast and with bitter herbs, dressed and ready to travel, eating in haste, because deliverance was coming before morning. And over every door where the blood was painted, death would have no claim. God himself explained what the blood would do, and the explanation is the heart of the whole night. In Exodus 12 verse 13, the Lord says, "The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt." Here was a distinction deeper than any that had come before. Through 9 plagues, Israel had been spared by geography. But on this final night, being in the right place was not enough. This time deliverance required the blood. Every house, Egyptian or Hebrew, lay under the same sentence of death, and the only thing that turned death aside was the blood of the lamb marked on the door. And at midnight the Lord did exactly what he had said. Exodus 12 verses 29 and 30 record the fulfillment with a restraint that makes it more terrible, not less. At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner, who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Not a house without someone dead. The cry that went up over Egypt that night was the sound of the entire pantheon's defeat gathered into one wail of grief, and at the center of it was the house of Pharaoh, where the son of the god-king lay dead like every other firstborn in the land. The divinity of Egypt's throne had been answered in the most personal way imaginable. The god on the throne could not save his own son. The whole long argument that had begun at the river reached its end in the silence of a dead prince in the palace. This time there was no bargaining, no hardening with the dawn, no compromise. In the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, the very men he had sworn would die if they looked on his face again, and he did not threaten them now. He begged them to go. In the words of Exodus 12 verse 31, the broken god-king says, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and your herds," he said, "everything you asked for, only go." The Egyptians themselves urged the Hebrews to hurry out of the land, pressing their silver and gold and clothing upon them, saying they would all die otherwise, and so Israel went out. Exodus 12 verse 37 records the multitude that left Ramesses that night, around 600,000 men besides women and children, a vast company that had gone into Egypt as a single family in the days of Joseph and now came out a nation. They had lived in Egypt 430 years. And on the very day that long sojourn ended, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. A people who owned nothing but the promise of God walked out of the most powerful kingdom on earth, and behind them lay a land whose every god had been weighed and found wanting. What had happened in those days never left the memory of Israel. The Passover did not end when the Hebrews crossed out of Egypt. It became the founding act of the nation's worship, commanded to be kept year after year as a lasting ordinance, so that every generation would tell its children what the Lord had done. Century after century, in good times and in exile, the people of Israel would gather to eat the lamb and the unleavened bread, and to recite the story of the night they were brought out of the house of slavery. The Exodus became the reference point for everything that followed, the great proof to which the prophets and the psalmists returned again and again when they wanted to say who their God was. He was the one who brought Israel out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Outside the pages of Scripture, the world of ancient Egypt that the plagues had humbled left its own traces in stone, and among them is one inscription that has fascinated historians for more than a century. On a black granite slab, known as the Merneptah Stele, carved around 1208 BC by a pharaoh celebrating his military campaigns, there appears the earliest known mention of Israel by name outside the Bible, listed among the peoples of Canaan as a group already established in the land. Scholars continue to debate the precise dating of the Exodus and the historical reconstruction of these events, weighing the biblical chronology against the archaeology of Egypt. But the stele stands as a hard fact in the record, not long after the period in which the events of the Exodus are traditionally placed. A people called Israel was real enough. and significant enough that a pharaoh of Egypt boasted of having dealt with them. And so the contest that had begun at the edge of a river ended with the gods of Egypt answered one by one, and a freed people marching east toward the sea. Happy and the Nile had run with blood. Hecate's frogs had died in heaps. The dust of Geb had bitten the land. The swarms had ruined the realm of the sacred beetle. The cattle of Hathor and Apis had fallen in the fields. The gods of healing had watched their priests collapse in sores. The sky of Nut and Seth had rained fire. The harvest of Osiris had been devoured. Ra himself had been put out for 3 days. And at last the god on the throne had buried his own son. The god who had no image and no temple in all of Egypt had proclaimed his name across the whole earth, exactly as he said he would, and the proof of it was a nation of former slaves walking free under an open sky, carrying with them the memory of the night their God passed over them, and the unanswerable knowledge of who the Lord is.